we. This afternoon, I want to discuss the subject of the mode of baptism. Although the word mode is really not a proper term when discussing baptism. It's more of a misnomer, but we might discuss that, or we'll discuss that a little bit later. But we use that term, mode of baptism, because of the way in which man uses the term baptism. If you go to a dictionary and look up baptism, I did it online, going to Webster's dictionary. One of the definitions that they gave was, quote, a Christian sacrament marked by ritual use of water and admitting the recipient to the Christian community. When I looked at the noun form of the word, they write, quote, a Christian ceremony in which a small amount of water is placed on a person's head, or in which a person's body is briefly placed under water. Then, in explaining it, they write, quote, in Christianity, baptism is the sacrament of admission to the church, symbolized by the pouring or sprinkling of water on the head, or by immersion in water. Now, that's what Mr. Webster will tell us baptism is. Can you understand then why the world is confused about what baptism is? But really, whenever you use a dictionary, you need to understand what a dictionary is and what it does and what it doesn't do. A lot of people mistakenly think that a dictionary's purpose is to give you the definition of a word. It's not. If it were only giving you the dictionary or the definition of a word, then dictionaries would not need to be updated. But back a few years ago, before the online capabilities that we have now, dictionaries were updated just about every year. They came out with a new one. This edition, every year, just about a new edition. Well, if they were just giving the definition of the word, they would never need updating. Instead, what we need to understand is that the purpose of a dictionary is to give the modern usage of a word. How is it being used at this point in time? The modern usage of a word does not necessarily mean that that's the definition of the word, though. If you looked at the word gay today, you would find a usage almost exclusively of being homosexual in our usage today. That took place over time, but that's not what the word gay means. It has nothing to do with the definition of the word. In reality, it's a nice perversion of the word instead of a definition. But as what I read in relationship to baptism, no one can really deny that that is the modern usage of the term baptism. Now, we're not talking about what it means. We're not talking about what it's as it's found in the Bible. We're talking about, and that's the purpose of the dictionary again, how is it used today? And really no one can deny that that is a very good application of the word as used today. there's, to use a couple of terminologies, there's the datative meaning that deals with the definition, the connotative meaning with the basic usage of the word. There's the etymology of a word, which goes back and sees how the word changes its usage over time, and how thus it can be used and where it came from, where did the word baptism come from? Well, it's an English word now, isn't it? Well, if you were looking at the etymology of the word, you would have to go back. It's actually a Greek word, and you would have to go back to the Greek meaning and what it means. Those are three terms that you need to be familiar with when you're studying words, though. When we look at, and since I mentioned the etymology of the word, the English word baptism, it really is a Greek word. Baptize, or any of its forms, in the Greek very simply means to immerse, or to dip, or to plunge. Scholars, and we look at their lexicons to find the meaning of a word, and again, really you're oftentimes dealing with the term as it is used in the period of time that lexicon is setting forth. When you're looking at Greek lexicons, there's classical Greek lexicons, there's lexicons that deal with modern Greek, there's lexicons that deal with New Testament times Greek, and all things along that line. Thus, you look at the definitions by these scholars, and I'm going to give you the first two. It's abbreviated BAGD and then BDAG. To give you some explanation of these, this was a study that was done by Bauer, and he was a German theologian, and going back and studying the Greek. When they translated it into English, it was first translated and enlarged upon by Arndt and Gingrich. And so it was given the abbreviation BAG, like a bag. Bauer, Arndt, and Gingrich. That was the first edition. When they came out with a new edition where they expanded it a little bit and added some things, Danker was added to that work, and so it became BAGD, Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, and Danker. In that second edition, they had this definition for baptism, or baptize. Quote, dip, immerse, and in the middle, dip oneself. Wash, in non-Christian literature, also plunge, sink, drench, overwhelm. They then came out with a third edition, and in that third edition, Danker became the primary one doing the work. And so it then took the abbreviations for BDAG, which was Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich. And he expanded it and reworked it as far as the presentation of it. And in that edition, he has, quote, in Greek literature, generally to put or to go under water in a variety of senses. To use water in a rite for purpose of renewing or establishing a relationship with God. Plunge, dip, wash, baptize, end quote. And so in both of these editions, even though the third edition expounded upon the second, they use the same terms in relationship to this word baptize. It's dealing with plunging or sinking, drinking or drenching, overwhelming. to dip, immerse, and all of those terms are used in relationship to this word baptize. Another lexicon that deals with New Testament times was Thayer. You'll hear a lot about his work. His work actually is a little bit older and is now, they say, outdated as far as scholarship is concerned, because he did his work before a lot of the newer discoveries as far as the Greek language. But he's still a very highly respected scholar along this line. He writes, quote, to dip repeatedly, to emerge, submerge, as the definitions for baptize. There's a set of lexicons done by Kittle, or edited by Kittle, and it's a 10-volume set. But then there's what's referred to as Little Kittles. They took that and abridged it into one volume. In that one volume, Little Kittles, they have, quote, to dip in or under, to die, to immerse, to sink, to drown, to bathe, or wash, end quote. A lot of our brethren use W. Vine's work, Expository Dictionary of New Testament Words. If you cannot read Greek, I highly recommend, or cannot find Greek words, I highly recommend using Vine's. It is an excellent work, even though it is not considered scholarly because it's not done that way. It's probably one of the best works that you can use as far as studying the Bible. He writes concerning baptize, quote, consisting of the process of immersion, submersion, and emergence, from bapto to dip, end quote. Now, those are just a short listing of the many, many lexicons that could be called upon. But in reality, they would all say basically the same thing. They might term it a little bit differently. They might rearrange the words, but it would say the same thing. You're not going to find any variation. And so, when you're dealing with the Bible word baptism as was used at that point in time when the New Testament was being written, you're dealing with an immersion or a submerging, completely going down under the water. But we go back to, there's the dictionary definition today. Can it not be accurate in relationship to baptism? And when we're talking about Bible baptism. Well, the New Testament writers, if they wanted to express the idea of sprinkling or pouring, the Greek language had words that expressed those ideas. When you get to the word sprinkling, there's the Greek word rantizo. One of the usages is found in Hebrews 9 and verse 13, where it says, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh. There's the blood of bulls and goats, the ashes of a heifer. He's talking about an Old Testament ritual in which they would mix these things, and then the priest would sprinkle that blood and the ashes upon things and purifying them. But it was literally a sprinkling of those elements upon those things. And so the Greek word rantizo expressed perfectly that word of sprinkling. When we get to the word pour, though, well, actually there are two Greek words that express the word, can be properly translated as pour. One of them is the Greek word balo. It's found, for example, in Matthew 26 and verse 12, when he says, "For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial." And there you have this woman coming and pouring an ointment upon Jesus, his feet. And so it is the expression poured, and using this Greek word balo, because it expresses that word, that idea of pour. Then there's the Greek word cheo, and that it's a cheo. The ch sound is supposed to be like the Greek or the German ch, and I can't do that, so you have to just excuse the pronunciation. It, though, when you're dealing with that word, is not used by itself in the New Testament. It is always used with a prefix, and then that is the root word. There are the prefixes kata, which means down, to pour down. Then it's used with the prefix ek, and thus ek meaning out or out of, a pouring out. Then there's the prefix epi, in which that word means upon, so a pouring upon. And then there's one that combines, actually there's two prefixes with the root word, huper, which means above or over, with ek, which means out, and thus an outflowing, or an overflowing, an overflowing or flowing over out of. But that's the idea when you have that huper, ek, and cheo. But the basic meaning of all of these terms, even though there's a prefix associated with the word, it still has that basic idea of pouring out, or to pour. And so if they wanted to express that idea, they could use that term. There's a passage in the Old Testament, though, that's very interesting along this line. And when we're dealing with the Old Testament, of course, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So you might say, well, Michael, how are you going to use that in relationship to these Greek words? Well, we're going to use the Septuagint translation. The Septuagint, oftentimes abbreviated as LXX, which is Roman numerals for 70. Why? Because it was translated by about 70 men around 270 BC. It was the basic Bible that Christ and the apostles used. They seldom used actually the Hebrew Old Testament. The majority of quotes in the New Testament from the Old Testament are from the Septuagint. But turn over to Leviticus 14 and verses 15 and 16, because here we're going to find an interesting passage along using the Greek Septuagint in relationship to this study. It says that the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand. And the priest shall dip his right finger in the oil that is in his left hand, and shall sprinkle of the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. We find all 3 terms being used in this these two verses. When it says, the priest shall take some of the log of oil and pour, the word pour there is from that Greek word, cheo, with the prefix epi. Epi, of course, as we said, meaning upon, and to pour upon. So he's taking this oil and pouring it upon his left hand. Then in verse 16 it says, and the priest shall dip his right finger in the oil. So he's got the oil in his left hand that he has poured into his left hand. He takes his right finger and dips it. And that word is the word bapto, from baptizo. He has dipped his finger into the oil. And then it says that he shall sprinkle of the oil with his finger 7 times before the Lord. And so now then he takes his finger out of the oil that is in his left hand that he has put his right finger in and sprinkles it, and he uses the Greek word, it's actually reno, which is from rantizo. He sprinkles it 7 times before the Lord. And so you have all 3 terms expressing different ideas in these 2 verses. So if the Greeks wanted to express this act of baptism as meaning sprinkling or pouring, then they could have done that. They had the words and they had the capability of doing such. They did not use those terms, though, in relationship to this act of baptism. Now, that's a rather detailed and complicated study, and I realize that, but I think it's necessary for our total understanding of what baptism is about. But when we go to the Bible, even if we don't know the Greek language and don't know all of the background of these Greek words and all of that, we can start seeing the same principle. In John the 3rd chapter, in verse 23, it talks about John was baptizing in Aenon near to Salem because there is much water there. And they came and were baptized. Here's John baptizing, but he's baptizing in a certain location. Why? Because there's much water there. And you don't need a great deal of water if you're just going to sprinkle some water on someone, or if you're going to pour some water upon someone. The need for much water is a need because you're going to submerge a person in the water. But then we turn over to Acts the 8th chapter. In verse 38 and verse 39, as Philip is preaching to the Ethiopian eunuch, it says that this Ethiopian eunuch commanded the chariot to stand still. And they went down both into the water, both Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And when they were come up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord caught away Philip, that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. I don't know how long I read that wrong, just to put it bluntly. As I read that, it was that they went into the water and Philip put him under the water. They were going down into the water, and that was the aspect of baptism, and he brings him up out of the water. That's not what he's saying there. He's saying that here's the Ethiopian, he stops the chariot, they get out, they go down into the water. That's one step. They're now in the water. That's not baptism. They're just in the water at that point in time. While they are now in the water, he baptizes him. That's the second step. So there's that act of baptism, and then there's a third step of coming up out of the water. It's much like when we baptize someone here in this baptistry. after getting all of the things off of the water, and so that we don't have all the humidity in here, and losing all of the water in the baptistry from the humidity and condensation, the one doing the baptizing will go down into the water and usually help the person who's going to be baptized get down into the water. They are now in the water. Baptism hasn't taken place yet. While they are in the water, then, there's the baptism that takes place. After that baptism takes place, then, they're not going to stay in the water, are they? They come up out of the water. They get out. And they dry off and get into their clothes again. From the standpoint, they've changed clothes for the baptism so that they don't get the clothes that they were wearing wet. That's the same process that you see here in Acts 8. They went down into the water. While they were in the water, Philip baptized him. Now, if baptism was a sprinkling or pouring, there would not be any need for them to go into the water. They could have just gotten a little bit of water there and sprinkled it upon him or poured it upon him, and that would have been it. There is no need to go down into the water. The only need for going into the water and coming up out of the water is if baptism is an immersion. So these acts, these descriptions simply do not fit with the act of sprinkling or pouring. They do fit, though, with the aspect or the idea of an immersion or a submersion. But then, baptism is also a burial. In Romans 6 and verse 3 and verse 4, Paul would say, "Know ye not that so many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." Where it says we are buried with him by baptism. Baptism is thus being described as a burial. The burial that we undergo is that burial that's in water, as we would see in the case of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts the 8th chapter. But it's still a burial. In Colossians 2 and verse 12, again it's stated, "Buried with him in baptism, wherein also ye are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead." So again, Paul expresses the idea of baptism with the idea of burial. It is a burial. When we bury someone today, we place a body completely under the ground. Jerry Moffat wrote in a lectureship book that, quote, "We don't bury people by sprinkling or pouring a little dirt on them," end quote. And he's absolutely right. We don't bury someone by just getting a little bit of dirt and sprinkling the dirt on them. No one would consider that burying or someone. We put them totally under the ground. Well, when we look at baptism, and it's described as a burial, the element not being the ground here, but being water, obviously, is you put them totally, completely under water. And so the act of baptism is an immersion or a submersion. Now, if a person has not been submerged in the water, then in reality they have not been baptized.